record this. Oh, thanks.
That was new.
Yeah, I know, right? So let me share this. Okay. Yeah. So what we're gonna do is slideshow. Okay. There we go. So priests from Salem to Midian. So we had discussed Adam and Eve pretty much already, and the language about how Adam and Eve were actually priests and kings in Eden, and since we're focusing on priests, yeah, they were working in holy space, they were working in sacred space, and they represented God to creation and represented creation to God. And they, in fact, made in God's image, and we are made in God's image. It's so this we're going to end up. I don't know if we're going to get as far as this scene right here. This is, I think, where the prince of Midian, which is Jethro or Moses's father-in-law, actually he acts as a priest to Israel very early on as well, and brings a sacrifice and has a meal with the elders and the priests of Israel. So just to kind of recap and intro this, and each time I kind of do it a little bit different, right? Just to kind of give it a little bit, to show a little bit of something else in there. So we know that Adam and Eve were royal priests working and ruling in a sacred space, which is Eden. They were working under the blessings of Eden. So Eden is the place where humanity can flourish because humanity is in the presence of God. Okay. When they became rulers of themselves, when they took that king idea and they decided that they were going to rule themselves and not be priests to God, but priests to their own, wishes, they were exiled from the sacred space and they ruled and worked under a curse. So they still ruled and they still worked, but they're not doing it with the blessing of Eden anymore. This is away from Eden. So part of the biblical story is, how does humanity get restored to royal priesthood operating under the blessings of Eden? Because we rule, and but we also oppress. We we represent the wrong things, and we're operating outside of Eden under a curse, and things, instead of like working to a new Jerusalem, we end up with New York. It's just like corruption and those sorts of things. So we always needed to go back to Adam and Eve. So we need a new Adam and new Eve. In other words, a restored humanity. We know who the new Adam is, and that's Christ. And I started, and if you look at the language in the Bible, who's Adam's bride? Adam's bride, flesh of his flesh, bone of his bones, and they're one flesh. Is Eve, right? But you have the new Adam, but who is his bride? And it is the church, and we are his body. And Paul in Ephesians even goes into like talking about the man leaving his wife and becoming one flesh with his wife. But he goes, but I'm actually talking about Christ, which is a mystery, but more on that later. So so we get included into this whole idea of being the royal priesthood. So priests appear throughout the whole narrative of the Bible, and they work in sacred space, in the sacred space Eden. They minister the praises and prayers of creation and bring that and they bring that into sacred space. So they also bring the blessings of Eden into the world. So part of what the priests do is that they bring a blessing to the world or to certain people, right? So we have portrayals of the Levitical priesthood and what the Levitical priesthood was like, and that's usually when you're what people think about when we talk about priests in the Bible, right? But there was always something missing. There's always something not quite right with the Levitical priesthood. We find out that it comes short, and that the priests are messing things up. Aaron is the first one of that line of priests, and one of the first things he does is create a an altar and a statue to Baal. And and if you go back in the story a little bit more, you find out that Moses was given the opportunity to not only be the political leader of Israel, but also to be the priest. It was really concession, with Moses complaining that he couldn't really talk right, or that he'd go send somebody else. That God goes, look, I'll have your brother do part of your job for you. Okay, he'll talk for you. You'll be over him, and you'll be in charge to him. But that's where God builds up the priesthood. But even Israel was given the opportunity to be a nation of kings and priests, a royal priesthood. And there was their lack of belief, again, which prevented that. So even though the offices of priest and king have been separated in the Bible, it was not originally that way. Adam and Eve were originally king priests, and so was the first priest ever mentioned in the Bible, which is Melchizedek. He was a priest and a king. And so we have little snapshots of how things should be. We know that things were wrong, but we have these little snapshots of king priests, or the way that priests could have been, or they project a royal priesthood that finally becomes true in Christ, and then gets rolled over into Christ's followers, and they become priests and kings. So I want to go back to Genesis 14, and this is the story of Abraham. And I don't know if I'm going to read all of this, but I'll kind of like sum it up, and I'll sum up a little bit of like what happened in chapters 13, in chapter 13. So what happens is that Abraham comes into the promised land, and he brings his nephew Lot with him, and Lot's family. And both of them started accumulating a lot of stuff and a lot of people around them and everything. And the land becomes a little bit crowded. It's like, well, this place isn't big enough for the two of us, or our two families. And Abraham says, why don't you choose? If you go this way, I'll go that way. If you go that way, I'll go this way. And they kind of split apart, and Lot goes down to the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham goes to the trees of Mamre, and those sorts of things. But what happens in due time is that there is Abraham. God talks to Abraham around that time, and he tells Abraham, look it, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to give you all this land. Go explore that land. Go to this land that I'm talking about, and go do that. So Abraham gets up, but he only goes a little ways away, and then he settles, right? And so it's like a small detail, but you're thinking, wait a minute, he obeys God and he trusts God, but only to a limited degree a lot of times, and he just doesn't quite follow through. And that's going to come up a little bit later in this story. We find Abraham, the one that God has chosen to do all this through, and we see him believing God on one hand, but also really messing up on the other hand, or just kind of like doing things halfway, and that becomes part of it. Now, what happens during this time when he's just kind of camped out, by the trees of Mamre, is that his nephew Lot, they get kidnapped. And so what happens here is in Genesis 14, it says, in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of, and you have all these kings, right? What happens is that the king of Sodom and Gomorrah and some other kings, they are subject to this um, Charlemander and these other kings, but they rebel and they're like, we're not going to pay tribute anymore. We're not going to do this, and so what happens is that they get defeated by those kings, and that those kings basically take a bunch of their possessions and their families and everything, and they kidnap them, and they go up and and somebody finally comes up to Abraham and says, "Hey, you know your nephew Lot, he's been caught up in this whole thing, and he's been taken." Now, I don't know if you remember this story, but if you go down to verse 5 here, it says, "In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, and Emim in Shaveh." These were all giant clans, okay? So these bad kings who go to who kidnap Lot, one of the things that they are able to do is to defeat the Rephaim, which are giants, the Zuzim, which are giants. They're in the region of Ham, where we remember where like the it was through Ham that these giants came into these lands, and the Emim in Shaveh, and so you know, we keep that in mind, because what happens is that Abraham, he goes after to get his nephew Lot back, right? But to do that, he takes 318 men. Now he's going up against the armies of four kings, but Abraham takes 318 men, and he defeats these four kings that just defeated these giants. So Abraham basically defeats the giant killers, and it's a miraculous upset, you know, this miraculous victory. So here a little bit more. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. They started running from the battle because they were losing. Some of them fall into these pits, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abraham's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and they went on their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abraham, the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and Aner. These were allies of Abraham. When Abraham heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born of his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So we're going, oh, okay, so he's going to Dan, which is kind of like north, right? Finally, he's going to the area that God told him to go check out in the first place. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. So he goes way up into Damascus area, way up into Syria, and well, modern day Syria. But this is also areas that God had promised to Abraham eventually. Um, so it's funny that, like, even though Abraham he hadn't really followed what God had told him to do, now he's kind of like having to, and now he's doing it because he's chasing some kings, and he's trying to get Lot back, right? Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. Here's Melchizedek comes in. So after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, I have a hard time with that, Chedorlaomer, and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh. So here comes, you know, Abraham comes into this valley, and then here comes the king of Sodom, right? And Melchizedek. So Melchizedek shows up at the same place. Melchizedek, king of Salem, which I said is Jerusalem. It's the same city. Brought out bread and wine. Uh, let's stop right there. Bread and wine, what does that sound like?
Communion.
Communion. So he's bringing out bread and wine, and you're going to see that this is another thing that you see that is overlaps with you know a priestly thing to do. He brings out bread and wine, which is also like just having a meal, but actually brings a priest. Now it says here in the brackets, he was priest of God Most High. And and the reader thinks in the back of their mind, wait a minute, how did this guy even know who the Most High God was, right? And he blessed Abraham, and he said, blessed be Abraham by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. Remember that he has delivered your enemies into your hand. It's about deliverance. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. So Abraham pays tithes to somebody, and you pay tithes to somebody um, who is a priest to you or who is greater, right? And the king of Sodom said to Abraham, now here comes the king of Sodom, and he says, give me the persons, but take the goods yourself. So give me the people that, like, the people, and but you can have the stuff. But Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you say, I have made Abraham rich. So, what Abraham's doing right now is like, I don't want the king of Sodom to have anything on me. I don't want this king of Sodom to be able to say, hey, you owe me something. He really doesn't want too much to do with this king of Sodom. And it's kind of like a way of like, the king of Sodom's like, hey, why don't you take all the stuff, just give me the people or whatever. And then but Abraham sees through that, so he's got a much different attitude towards this king of Sodom than he does the king of Salem. So Abraham says, I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share. Now, right here, right after this is Genesis 15. And what's Genesis 15? That is when God appears to Moses and says, I'm going to, like, come outside and look at the stars and see the sand, your offspring is going to be like these. And whoever blesses you, I will bless. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And it's put strategically, um, these things are put strategically, like, in their place, that there's a great victory. Melchizedek recognizes the hand of God on Abraham. He blesses God and blesses Abraham. He's the first priest in the Bible, and in a sense, he's the most exalted priest in the Bible besides Christ. In fact, Melchizedek gets compared to Christ in the book of Hebrews. And David even foresees this. And Lynn Ann and I were talking about this uh, a little bit earlier. So it's a very telling picture. Today, I just kind of want to go over these stories and kind of show you the context of where they're at. Um, and the second priest that's ever mentioned in the Bible is not what you would expect. And I haven't seen that many commentary on what this priest is, or why he's mentioned, but it happens in Genesis 41, and that is when Joseph um, interprets Pharaoh's dreams and then is raised up to a high position, and he's given this woman in marriage who is the daughter of the priest of On. So let's look at that a little bit. So Joseph gave his proposal that Pharaoh should store up grain for 7 years, and then during the fruitful years, and then during the lean years that he should sell it, and make money and gain power. So verse 37 here, it says, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom is the Spirit of God? In other translations, or it might say, or in whom is the Spirit of the gods. What does that sound like? This sounds like Daniel, right? When Daniel is when Daniel interprets the dream, basically, of Nebuchadnezzar. These same kind of things are said about him, and the same sort of things are done to him. So Daniel's story is very, very much like Joseph's story, and the language is the same. Like where you have a pagan world empire leader saying, "Who's like this?" and like, "In whom is the spirit of the gods?" or "In whom is the spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning as wise as you are. So, the Daniel being put on over the wise men. So nobody as wise as Daniel, right? Well, there's nobody so discerning and wise as Joseph in this case. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in garments of fine linen. These garments of fine linen, I was reading about, these were priestly garments, according to one writer, right? And but you got to remember that priests were also sometimes in very powerful positions. Then so he puts them in these fine linens, and he puts a gold chain around his neck, and he made him ride in his second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. But here in verse 44, moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent, no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphana Paneah. So just like Nebuchadnezzar renames Daniel, Pharaoh renames Joseph, and he not only ingrains him into the Egyptian culture, just the way that like Nebuchadnezzar ingrains Daniel into that culture, but he also puts him in charge, and so he makes him a full, he ends up like shaving his head. He ends up dressing like an Egyptian, and really, it's that first instance that we see going back to our exile series that the people of God can go into the land of exile, which Joseph is in exile, just like Daniel, right? And um, be that water in a dry place, and be that blessing to that kingdom, even, and in that place. And the way that the Isaiah or Jeremiah said, whenever you go into Babylon, build vineyards, have children, be, basically be fruitful, be multiply, and you have that Eden imagery again. So here um, you have Joseph bringing in that Eden imagery into Egypt, and it's that sort of thing where Joseph and Daniel always give God the credit for everything um, and so that is how that's their witness. But other than that, they go and flourish in that land, and they even become part of that culture, so to speak. So he renames him, and he gave him in marriage Asenath. Asenath actually means a gift of Ra, or a gift of Sun Ra, God. So she's the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. Um, and On is the religious center in Egypt at the time. So he marries basically um, the the I think it's the high priest of the most influential religious center in Egypt. He marries her daughter, his daughter, his daughter, and instead of having, I also think it's interesting that this is Potipharah, the priest, as opposed to Potiphar, whose wife tried to sleep with Joseph. So, you have this illegitimate thing that like was tried on Joseph by Potiphar's wife, but now he's legitimately married to Potipharah's daughter. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. So skipping ahead, when you get to before the year of famine came, two sons were born to Joseph. So she becomes the mother of Ephraim and Manasseh, two of the Israel's tribes, as a matter of fact. So Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardships and all my father's house. But here, check out verse 52. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. That is a claim of exile. It's in the land of exile. God has made me able to flourish, and that becomes such a huge theme. Now, I haven't known what to do with this whole idea, really, of the priest of On thing, but every time that she is mentioned, Asenath is mentioned, the Bible goes out of the way to say she's the daughter of the priest of On. So there's something about like him marrying into this priesthood. What I think is interesting is that if you bookend the beginning of Israel going into Egypt and the beginning of their exit out of Egypt, on the front end of it, you have Joseph, who is married to the prince of On, and at the back end of it, you have Moses, who is married to the daughter of Midian. So they both end up marrying priests' daughters. Only one of them, is not a priest of God. He's the priest of the sun god Ra. But at the end of it, you have Moses. He marries the daughter of the prince of Midian, and this prince of Midian is a priest of the Most High God. And you have that language again of Melchizedek. So when you get to Exodus 2, the priest of Midian, it says, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew waters and filled the troughs. So basically, these shepherds came and they drove them away, but Moses comes up and he saves them and he waters their flock. She goes and tells her father the story, and he says, then where is he? And why have you left this man? Call him that he may eat bread. There you have that thing, that he may eat bread. And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. She gave birth to a son, and she called him Gershom, for he said, I have been a sojourner in a foreign land. It's the same language that Abraham would use, being a sojourner in a in a foreign land. Where was it here that? Okay, so Exodus 17. Okay, now we're fast forwarding, and we're going to go to after they've escaped from Egypt, and they've already gone through the Red Sea and everything. They passed through this, but then you have in Exodus 17, you have this battle that again, Moses and the people of Israel miraculously win, just like Abraham miraculously wins over those kings, right? This is the story where Moses' hands grow tired, and so they sit him down on a stone, and then you've got Aaron and Hur that held up his hands on one side and the other, and so when his hands were steady, um, when his hands were up, then they were winning the battle, and when his hands fell down, then they were losing the battle. So they held up his hands, and that's how the battle is won. And so Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Right at the end of this miraculous victory, then you have Exodus 18, where Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for the people of for his people, how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, had taken Zipporah, Moses' wife, and he had sent her home along with her two sons. And but anyway, skipping down to verse 5, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses in the wilderness where he was encamped at the mountain of God. So he comes out and meets Moses. And when he had sent word to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, I'm coming to meet with your wife and her two sons. Moses went out to meet his father-in-law and bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other of their welfare and went into the tent. Then Moses told his father in law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardship that had come upon them in the way, and how the Lord had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced for all the good that the Lord had done to Israel, in that he had delivered them out of the hands of the Egyptians. Now, check this out. Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hands of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because in this affair they dealt arrogantly with his people. And Jethro, Moses' father in law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God. And Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father in law before God. So here you have, before anything is really done by the Levitical priesthood, um, you have Jethro performing a priestly act on behalf of Israel. He's acting as Israel's priest, and he's being a priest of the Most High God. And he brings the offering, and then when they have the offering, you have that same sort of communion scene again, right? Where um, they sit down and they eat in the presence of God, and it says here that Moses and Aaron and all the elders of Israel come and they eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. So you have this repeating of those themes again, and and I just kind of wanted you to see that like in the story. It's a little bit hard to describe, but but you see this, you see these snippets again that, on one hand you have Melchizedek, um, who, and we've talked about him, but now you have a little bit of another snapshot in this guy, Moses' father-in-law, who is a priest of the Most High God, and we're like, how did he get to be priest of the Most High God? Because, and he is before the Levitical priests as well, because the Levites, um, aren't until later on in the story. So you have two people who are acting as priests to the people of God, and they're not from Israel, and they are priests of the Most High God, and they have these communion scenes. They also have the same thing where it's like they're coming on the heels of a miraculous win in a battle, and these stories kind of like trace along with each other, and they kind of like bounce off of each other. So you have like priesthood and themes running um, kind of in the face of the Levitical priesthood and the Levitical ideas, um, really before the Levitical priesthood even gets going. And that's kind of like where I'm going to leave it off today. But we're going to go back in time next week, and we're going to look at like Moses' story and Aaron's story, and how it came to be that how the Levitical priesthood was really more of a concession, it appears, than God's plan A. God's plan A, we see a little, was really what we see in Christ, and ultimately what we see in the church. So that's where we leave it today. Um, it's a lot, huh? Especially for you today, huh, Lynette? Yeah. 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 Go ahead.
What is the timeline, uh, the verse where there were the king that do not judge? I mean, how long was that? You don't know him, you would know of him. How long? So
about 400 years.
How many years?
400.
400 years.
Yeah. Yeah. It was a long time. Yeah. So
Between what?
between the time, so Jerry was asking how long of a timeline between the Pharaoh who had raised Joseph up to be like so important to the Pharaoh who made slaves out of them, and then they were there for 400 years. Uh, so there was quite a gap there. Yeah. Um, and yeah, there is. This week I learned something. Um, if you go back to Genesis 1 and 2 and the Garden of Eden, and you see like the rivers that come out of, the waters that spring up. Like I said, it's like theological geography. I found a better term for it, not cosmic geography, but theological geography, where it's telling you something. You have the chaos waters, which are bad and chaotic, but it's also God's canvas that he uses that to make life-giving water as well. But there's two words that you have one that's kind of a chaos water, you have another word that's used for the life-giving water, right? Now that life-giving water is the water that feeds all of the Garden of Eden, and it flourishes, and it feeds these four rivers: the Gihon, the Tigris, the Euphrates. Um, if you look at where those rivers are, one of them is the main water source in Jerusalem, right? One of them is in Egypt. One of them is Two of them are in Babylon, and one of them is in Syria. And what happens is that later on in the story, you have the people from Jerusalem, and they end up in exile. They end up in exile in Egypt. They end up in exile in Babylon. They end up in exile in Syria. And so you have a picture, really. You have this message from the first pages of the Bible that, like, this is going to be a, a source, living water, that is going to be brought to these places, even these places of exile, like Egypt, like Babylon, like Syria. So you have characters like Daniel, you have characters like Joseph, and they bring life, but it's also their places of exile. And that's another, like, one of those themes that, like, when Christ starts talking about, like, out of you shall come rivers of living water. It goes all the way back to that Edenic theme, and that theme of, like of a, a life-giving water in a dry place that makes things flourish. And that is kind of like where, once you see that, then you it starts bringing a little bit more sense to the idea of Joseph ending up in the place of exile. Because when you've read the Bible all the way through, and then you go back and you see Joseph, man, he is in the land of exile now. It's like this is going to be Israel's exile. they're going to be oppressed in that place, you know. But it really starts with somebody who is a real servant of God, who is actually bringing life and you know, like and blessing to Egypt, um, and just the same way that Daniel does later on in Babylon. And those stories are like such echoes of each other, you know. And that's sort of like the things that the New Testament writers see as Christians in their persecution and in their you know, like in the you know, being the salt of the earth, and all this Babylon around us, and us being in you know, these places of exile and living in exile, to actually be that source of living water, to be that source of blessing, and to be the priests that we've been called to be, to bring back the nations. This is how God was going to. This is ultimately like how God starts bringing back nations, to bring that water into a dry land. He does that through Abraham and his seed, including us. Quite a story, right? You know?
I've got a quick question.
Yeah.
Might be out of ignorance. Joseph that we're talking about that remarried and had more children, correct? When you spoke of Joseph that
Mhm.
remarried, is that the same Joseph as Joseph and Mary?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah. It's
No,
way.
okay.
Yeah. Wait. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah. That would
okay.
be confusing. Yeah.
Okay.
No. So
Okay.
yeah, this
Just,
Joseph who. Yeah, this Joseph. This is much earlier. Same name. Yeah. It's
okay.
the same name.
I
Same.
was like, wait, okay. I
Yeah.
thought so, but I
It
just
is the
wanted
same name.
to.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No. This is like way at the beginning. This is at the beginning of Israel. Israel
Right.
starts with
Back to
Israel's
Genesis.
12 tribes. That means 12 brothers, right? Joseph
And
is technically one of those brothers.
okay.
Um,
Just make sure.
but 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 he never really has a tribe mentioned like under his name. It gets
Okay.
mentioned under his son's name, which are Ephraim and Manasseh. So,
Gotcha.
but like he's a son of Jacob, who is Israel.
Okay.
So the
I
story basically is that because of Joseph rescuing everybody, and then the king's really happy in the long run and says, "Why don't you bring your family here?" They go into the land of Joseph, um, uh, Goshen, and which is Goshen is this area in Egypt, or whatever, that says you guys can live in this place, and it's good, it's great farmland. And they basically, you know, you have these Edenic sort of like motifs in Goshen as well, like where they really build like a sort of a semi Eden, you know, like in Goshen. But but they're but they grow from, you know, like you know, a family with all their, you know, like with all their servants and everything, into like a million people over 400 years, you know. And years later, that Pharaoh, 400 years later, he doesn't remember Joseph and that story or whatever. He's just like, look at all these people, where they come from, and they're becoming too many of them, and they're going to take over unless we do something about this. So he makes them all slaves, and that's where Moses comes in.
okay. I thought so, but I just wanted to make sure in my head because
Yeah,
you're right. A lot for
yeah.
me.
It gets confusing because sometimes you say Joseph and like, wait, you know, Mary and Joseph, or Joseph?
I was
Yeah,
like, wait a minute, what happened to Mary?
Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. That's the one we're talking about.
Okay, gotcha. Gotcha. Thank you, Mark.
No problem. Yeah, the Technicolor Dreamcoat. I've never seen that. Yeah, I don't think I'm missing anything with that. Yeah. But anyway, these I know I got a little bit like further than us just talking about priests, but I wanted you to see a little bit more of the story, because it's like these mosaic of ideas, and like how these stories kind of repeat themselves in certain ways, like God has this pattern of like putting things in a certain order that like and then the biblical authors, like also, like do their arranging of their stories in purposeful ways, like why, they're going to mention that battle of Moses holding his hands up right before the appearance of Jethro to bless Israel and act as their peace, like Melchizedek does, even though really he's not really addressing the battle. He's talking about like the thing with the Egyptians or whatever. But the way that it's arranged, and then after the Abraham story, then you have like this fire from heaven sort of thing, with Sodom and Gomorrah a little bit later. But in the Moses story, then you have the fire from heaven on Mount Sinai and all that kind of stuff. So there's all these parallels. Like scholars like geek out about like all these like the Moses story being arranged in parallel with the Abraham story, and then using the same language. Like I'm a sojourner here, like Abraham said. Joseph says it, and those sorts of things. So that it's like these plays off of things, and then that becomes a play off of things way later that happen with like Daniel reflecting on the Joseph story and stuff like that. It's all these patterns, and it's really cool. It helps
That's
you.
why we have you, Mark, to help us.
Yeah, well, it's
help me understand.
like there's like a new pattern you start like uncover. It goes pretty far. It's really cool. I can't remember all of it, but of course, and I haven't scratched the surface actually, but yeah, it's pretty cool. But I bring those things up just because we are studying, the grand, the epic story of the Bible, and the themes, and like the design patterns, and the mosaic of ideas that you have layered over each other.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think we'll call it a night, and
Thank
I'll
you.
talk to you guys next week. Okay.
Take care, everybody.
All right.
See you, Linnell.
Bye-bye, Rachel.